If you ever said you wanted a less dumb Braveheart with a starring lead who hasn't succumbed to the brainworms yet, well, Netflix granted your wish. Netflix's Outlaw King is, depending on how you want to look at it, a long-delayed sequel to Braveheart or a patch job on the same movie. In fact, it picks up exactly where Braveheart leaves off. William Wallace has just been brutally executed by the English, and his body parts sent to 4 different places in Scotland and near the English-Scottish border on England's side. The Scottish resistance to King Edward I of England's regime has seemingly been squashed, and one of the main rival claimants to the Scottish throne, Robert Bruce, has been forced to bend the knee to Edward I. The difference from Braveheart is that Outlaw King isn't content with just being a series of inspirational speeches and battles, although it still takes time to have a hot, naked sex scene with star Chris Pine. And it actually does care about historical accuracy, up from actual big events all the way down to the little details about medieval life and warfare. Even the stuff you might think just got tossed in there for dramatic effect actually has at least some basis in the historical record. Robert Bruce stabbing a rival claimant to the Scottish throne, John Comyn, who is pro-English, right in the middle of a church? Actually, he did. And it turns out the English really did capture Robert Bruce's wife, the Anglo-Irish noblewoman Elizabeth de Burgh, and suspended her in a small wooden cage out a window. The only difference is that it might have been Edward I who ordered it, not his son, Prince Edward, the future Edward II. But of course, we'll come back to the subject of realistic depictions of real-life people to talk about how King Edward II is portrayed in this movie, because you know I still got a lot to say about that. What about the English in general? While Edward I is anything but a misunderstood warlord, he does take chivalry very seriously, and he isn't an outright monster by any stretch, unlike the Edward I of Braveheart. The English are shown to have their own personal, justified grievances with the Scottish. When the pro-Bruce nobleman Angus MacDonald retakes his estate, which had been confiscated by the English, he very well could be seen as the villain of another historical epic told from the English point of view. In any case, I do like the movie because it's dirty and grimy, just like medieval life was. People dumped chamber pots into the streets, butchers slaughtered pigs and cows right outside in front of their shops, and while most people probably didn't bathe only once a year as one myth about the Middle Ages has it, even wealthier people only had a few items in the wardrobe and didn't wash them as often as we would. Scotland itself is no utopia of dancing, smiling peasants until the mean old English came along. The movie understandably doesn't really delve into it, but it is implied that Scotland is the Florida of medieval Europe, which, well, is kind of, sort of, accurate.
Hey, you see that hill over there? It's Loudon Hill. I'll fight you under it tomorrow. These people.
Please don't hate me for saying that Scotland is awesome, especially now that England and the US are slowly going insane. Please let me live in your wonderful and beautiful country. It's also violent in a way that makes even Braveheart look like Pocahontas by comparison. We actually see a little of what becomes of William Wallace's remains, and we see a man have his guts cut open. One rather skittish film reviewer dismissed the movie for being too dirty and gory. Seeing that review actually made me a little angry. It's like seeing someone criticize a movie about Caligula for having too much creepy sex and too many violent orgies in it. To be honest though, I might be biased because I've genuinely become desensitized to violence. I mean, I've never been a soldier on a real battlefield or anything like that. But there was this time when I was a grad student and I was so broke and hungry I stabbed a man to death for a teriyaki chicken sub from Subway. Did you know that when you stab someone, by the way, it isn't like in the movies and they just kill over? Actually, he just kept coming at me and I just kept stabbing and hacking away. It felt pretty horrible, especially because his wife and kids watched the whole thing. That was one hell of a sub, though. Anyway, I don't mean to say that Outlaw King doesn't forsake all the suspected Hollywood touches for the sake of realism. For instance, despite being an arranged marriage carried out under English pressure, Robert Bruce has a fairly standard love story with his bride Elizabeth. She also becomes a loving stepmother to Robert's daughter from his last marriage, Marjorie, who incidentally is the ancestor to the future Stuart dynasty, and the current British royal family. But Elizabeth de Burgh is the type of female protagonist I can get behind. She's a strong woman without coming across as a modern feminist who just got separated from the Doctor and is trying to get back to the TARDIS. And unfortunately, like a lot of medieval women who didn't leave behind their own writings or happen to be monarchs in their own right, there really isn't much in the historical record about Elizabeth de Burgh's life and personality. So it's more than okay for them to fill in the blanks and use that to add another dimension to the story. Also, they took advantage of gaps in the record to give Robert Bruce a friendship soured into a rivalry with Edward II, who comes across as the bungling frat boy to Robert Bruce's straight-A student. Okay, sorry. I'm skipping ahead again. So let me instead talk about the actual life of Robert the Bruce. One of the things the movie touches on pretty well is that it wasn't just Robert Bruce rebelling against the English. Since the untimely death of Margaret the Maid of Norway from illness in 1290, there were multiple candidates for the Scottish throne by hereditary right. So many, in fact, that it seemed like the country was headed towards civil war, like I talked about in my Braveheart review. But what was the big deal? Couldn't they just find the guy who was most closely related to the last monarch and boom, there you go? Well, unfortunately it wasn't that simple. For one thing, Scotland was, even more so than other medieval European kingdoms, home to lots of powerful magnates. And 13 of those magnates all were descended from one king of Scotland or another. Plus the king of Norway, who just claimed it on the basis that he was married to a Scottish princess and was the father of the late Margaret the Maid of Norway. But there are also questions that, if medieval Europe had read it, would have launched a 4-year-long thread fueled by a flame war between royal succession nerds. There is no doubt that the Scottish followed primogeniture, where preference to succession went to the oldest child, but while it was clear that women and the sons of women could succeed under Scottish succession law, did the succession laws follow agnatic principles, where male lines of descent are favored over female lines of descent, or cognatic, where anyone closest to the royal line should succeed, regardless of if they got there through descent from a woman or a man? What about men married to women with their own strong claims to the throne? Even if we were being all sexist and giving the claims of men to the Scottish throne preference over those of women, if a man is married to a woman with her own really strong line of descent from a Scottish king, should the value of her claim boost her husband's? What if their claims combined in the form of their children? What if they have no living children? Actually, talking about children, should people with direct heirs be given preference over those with no direct descendants? Are we going by proximity by degree, where representatives of the closest generation to the common ancestor were favored, so, for example, your title might not go to your grandson, but instead to your other son, or your grandson's uncle? And what about children born out of wedlock? Should they be considered equally with those descended from people who were born in marriage, or should their claims get second place behind those descended from children born in wedlock, or should they be excluded altogether? And what about tanistry, that old kooky Celtic succession system where the heads of various clans got to elect as king anyone from a specific royal bloodline? Did that still apply, as it did in the old days of the Scottish monarchy? Or was it totally ended in 1005 when King Malcolm II brought in new succession laws? Or did a succession crisis mean that tanistry ought to be used to pick the next king again? And I still probably didn't cover everything. The bottom line is, Robert Bruce was one of the stronger candidates, but from a certain point of view, his claim still wasn't as good as that of John Baliol, that guy who William Wallace actually fought to put on the throne. The problem was that John Baliol had wound up exiled to France, making it a bit hard for him to keep the cause running. Bruce, on the other hand, had opposed John Balliol from the very beginning, and was among the nobles who wanted Edward to step in to prevent a civil war. After the First War of Scottish Independence, which ended with Wallace's execution, Bruce genuinely did vow allegiance to King Edward I, as the movie starts. However, he and John Comyn had made a secret agreement that one would support the other as king in exchange for some of their family lands. However, Comyn proved himself to be a true politician by deciding, why do that when I can just betray Bruce to King Edward and get his lands anyway, while keeping my own, which led to Comyn getting killed in church. And with that, Robert Bruce claimed the Scottish crown, and the Second War of Scottish Independence was on. As the title suggests, it didn't go well for Robert Bruce at first, and he really did become a king who was also an outlaw. But the Scottish, while sick of war, were sicker of the English openly running their country, and flocked under Robert Bruce's banner. If nothing else, the movie actually does capture Robert Bruce's desperation, and that sense of wary hope the Scottish placed in him. And the movie did all this without invoking anachronistic patriotic cliches like another movie I could name. While the movie does stick pretty close to the actual story of Robert Bruce, the climax, where Bruce enters a personal duel with Edward II, is purely fabricated. Even the part where Edward II has a breakdown and runs back to the English border is pure fiction. In fact, there's not even any proof that Edward II and Robert Bruce ever actually met on the battlefield, even though Edward II was put in charge of the campaign against Scotland. Again, I'm okay with that. It makes Bruce's struggle against the English more personal. What I'm not so okay with is, surprise, surprise, the portrayal of Edward II yet again. Now let me get this out of the way. It's not nearly as bad as the homophobic caricature of Edward II from Braveheart. Instead, this Edward II just comes across as overeager, maybe slightly psychopathic, the medieval equivalent of the tyrannical manager at Amazon, who is really enthusiastic about CrossFit in his private life. Again, let me emphasize that this is an improvement over whatever the hell Mel Gibson was giving us. Still though, it's distracting given how nuanced the characters of Edward I and most of the other English are, and generally how subtle and true to the history the rest of the movie tries to be. To be fair, technically this interpretation of Edward II isn't inaccurate either. We don't know much about Edward II's life before he became king, and what we do know about his biography does suggest that he wasn't all that good at war, and that he had more than a bit of a sadistic streak, even if it didn't really appear until later in life. Still, it would have helped if this portrayal was balanced by one or two characteristics that modern audiences would see as a plus, like Edward II preferring the company of lower-class people over that of nobles, like he did in real life. That's something that would smooth the edges for contemporary viewers, but was seen as a horrible trait in a prince at the time. And what about Edward II's sexuality? Well, the movie doesn't go there, apart from a blink and you'll miss it scene where Edward talks to Gaveston. Again, to be fair, the movie's called Outlaw King, not Sodomite Prince. And who knows, maybe in the current climate the filmmakers didn't want to open their movie up to accusations that they had a nasty gay villain, even though Edward was almost certainly what we would call gay or bisexual today. But I do think when you have a historical character who's traditionally counted among history's great queers, you do have something of an obligation to address it. Again, it might have been a trait that would have made his character more three-dimensional and sympathetic, something the character in this movie desperately needs. Maybe they meant to imply that the whole reason Edward II is so desperate to be a medieval manly man isn't just because he's the son of one of the great warrior kings of all medieval Europe, but because he was trying to prove his masculinity despite being sexually attracted to men, and all the ugly stuff his society told him that entailed. If so, though, the movie has it as a subtext, and you'd have to know who this crazy, angry guy really is to get it. Once again, I have to say it could be worse. but not really addressing it at all just isn't enough. Even in pure storytelling terms, sidestepping his sexuality just helps make Edward II a much weaker antagonist than the film deserves. Please don't take this as a criticism of actor Billy Howell, who plays Edward II. He really does do the most out of the material he's been given. It's just that Edward II is written as completely flat in a movie where most of the other characters are pretty well rounded. So it's not just about my hang-ups and obsessions. By the way, if you've got connections to a studio or a director with funding or something, let me know if you're interested in doing a movie that will redeem Edward II. I have a script and everything. Contact me through Patreon, please, for the love of God. It's a major blind spot in the movie. While inconsistent in how much it commits to a reasonably complex portrait of the times and peoples involved, I did still enjoy Outlaw King. It genuinely does a lot to address the problems people had with Braveheart, while still being a pretty good medieval action epic. At the very least, I definitely think lovers of the medieval world and Scottish history will get something out of it. Not to mention another key demographic, lovers of bearded Chris Pine.